we just put out this big statement about anti-Asian racism, but this is something, and so many other Christians of color signed this, and it's like we need to make sure that we are in solidarity with each other, you know,
Yeah,
and
that's good.
it's not about, because I think for a lot of Asians, this is the first time that they're like, hey, like I need to stand up and do something because like our house is burning right now, right? But
Yeah.
it's like, how do we care for everyone else when their house is burning too? And so
Hmm.
like we want to talk with you know, respected members of the Black community like yourself, but Native Americans and Latinos as well,
Hmm.
and be like, hey, how do we stand up against racism together and for each other?
Yeah.
And so I guess that was kind of just the basic idea, is wanting to ask you why you chose to sign the statement, and then even like for you, what you think would be tangible steps for Asian Americans and African Americans, Christians, to be standing up for each other or partnering with each other. Like, how can we do that well, do that better moving forward?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is we definitely need to have conversations like this. We don't know each other's stories, and so and just as I was speaking with Helen Lee and Vivian even last week, it's just that when you look at the outworking of racial trauma and how this works, and when you look at how white supremacy also works, it's divide and conquer, and no group wants to be on the bottom. And so that has been used. Our differences have been exploited, and I think one of the things when we look at certain communities, because you see certain communities, there's more in different areas of the country as it relates to more marginalized groups. And I think it's just a conversation where we can take on the role of the oppressor, and oppress each other. And that is also an outworking of racial trauma. It's like hurt people. And
Mm-hmm.
we've done that to each other. And so, we can look at, a lot of anti-Asian racism within various communities, anti-Black racism within various communities, and so I think it's just one of those things that we haven't really talked about and explored. I think there were some conversations in California when you go historically back to like the LA riots, and
Mm-hmm.
going back to a shooting, and so we create these narratives. So a lot of this is flowing from racial narratives, and so we have these racial narratives that most people embrace, and most people believe, and we ingest, and we create, we discriminate, and we have racial biases around that, and among each other. And I think that's the thing, that we have to name it, and we have to educate our children differently. But when it comes to our children, one of the things we encourage people, some of the beginning stages is that of proximity, that of building relationship, that of getting to know, each other. And I think if you don't grow up in communities where that is done, if you didn't go to a school, or you didn't live in a neighborhood or a city or a church where that is a part, that relationship building is a part of the structure, you have to do something very intentional to broaden yourself. For me, I grew up in a military town, so I grew up around a lot of, even in my neighborhood, and so that comes very natural to me, and that has helped me as it relates to understanding the story, understanding history, understanding Asian American history, learning about Latinx history, learning about Native American history. That is something, because of what I do, that is something that I learn from people, but I also educate myself by reading from authors and different things, and getting a deeper understanding. But if people are not intentional about that, we don't know each other's story. And so the thing that you believe is those narratives that you've been told, or what you've seen on TV. And so you have communities, and you have kids that are growing up, and if we're not intentional with our children, and making sure that they are in diverse spaces, or that they have relationships, or we're denouncing the lies, the racial narrative lies to them, they perpetuate the same thing. And so if we don't open up a conversation about this, you know, there will be no unity, you know what I'm saying? There is no oneness, you know. Taya Beatty, I think he was on Twitter. I don't know if you guys saw that, but there was a video of a Asian American man that was being taunted by Black people, and I don't know, in that community, I think in San Francisco. It was horrible, you know. And so I'm just saying, but we have to talk about the why, and how do we move beyond that? How do we have racial healing amongst marginalized groups? And that's one of the things we've been talking about, Be the Bridge. And the reason why I signed this is because this is something that's on my heart, because when we talk about racial healing, when we talk about oneness and unity, that's not just, there's more than black and white in the world, you know. And so that message of reconciliation has to be inclusive. I think there's a different type of conversation that Black and white people have to have, you know, historic. There's a very long history that goes back to the Atlantic slave trade, and then there's a different story that Native Americans have to have, you know, and then there's a different story that the community has to have, and then the Asian American community. So all those stories are different, but it doesn't mean that they cannot connect, and they cannot be in solidarity, and they cannot support each other without trying to play who's more oppressed, game. We have to understand the African American story in this. We need to understand the Native American story. We need to understand the Latin American story. And so I think that's, one of the reasons why I signed this, is because we're actually creating a discussion guide tool that will release over the summer, probably late summer with everything now, that will start provoking conversations like this in Be the Bridge groups. And so we're always trying to create that. And we've been working on that for the last 2.5 years almost, it's been a very hard thing to, I'm sorry, I'm gonna pull this up right here. It's been a very hard thing for us to write, because we've had to have so many voices, and getting those voices to sound succinct has been very difficult. And so it's kind of like the first iteration of this, but it will at least start some of the conversations, so that as we're talking about oneness, that oneness is, and we get to know each other. I've learned so much just understanding the Native American story. And when we talk about 40 acres and a mule, and how something like that is so offensive to Native Americans, but if I didn't know that story, talking to Helen last week, understand, I forget the word she used in Korean, that was basically describing if something is done to you, like if you face the injustice, you just basically take it, you just suck it up, and yeah,
and the word Han.
And how, right, what is it called?
I think it's Han. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, and she was just saying, like, you don't voice it, you're not vocal about it, you just keep it basically moving, which causes layers of racial trauma and shame and issues within the culture. But from a Black person looking in, when I see a person of Asian descent that's not standing up, not just for themselves or for the rights of anyone else, I may take offense to that, not understanding that culturally, that's a cultural thing that you're fighting against, and how my culture has been very different. It's been about fight. It's been very vocal. It's been very loud. It's been about protest. It's been about, from the moment, enslaved people landed, on this land, it's been about rebellion, and so there's a different cultural norm. So that not having that understanding could cause a barrier between me and Asian Americans. But when I get to know you and I understand your story and I understand your culture and I understand the history and understand why things are, there's a deeper empathy and an understanding and how we can have a conversation on how do you raise your voice, kind of like what the book that Kathy Kane has written, understanding the culture now. Like, she's going against the cultural norm. That's an upside down culture for her to write a book about raising your voice, and why she wrote the book, telling people to raise your voice, especially reaching out to Asian American people to use that power. So that was a long answer, but yeah.
Can I just add, this is Vivian Mabuni, since we're not doing a video.
Nice.
But I remember Tasha, Amina Brown, and Joe Saxton and I, we had a women of color event, and we before a large conference that had a lot of white people at it. So it was the very first one, and it was a luncheon, and each of us went and shared a little bit about our ethnic journey, just a few pointers. And so one of the things that I shared to, I think the majority in the audience in that as women of color were African American. So I was sharing about Asian American culture and how we wait for a pause in the conversation. We don't speak on top of each other. And so usually the conversation it's like trying to merge onto the communication freeway, waiting for that pause. And typically the conversation goes 3 stops and the Asians still didn't get a chance to speak into the conversation. So I think a lot of times when we're talking, even within communities of color, Tasha, what you mentioned was really, really true, that there is the learning of the culture so that there's an appreciation. So I remember hearing from my Latina sister where she had spoken about the strength of a Black woman to protest, but the strength of the Japanese woman during the internment was that she walked with pride as she, marched to the trains that took her to the internment camp. That was a show of strength, but it just wasn't the same way. And so I think that there are stories that we don't hear about. I remember my friend who's, I think his family member, either a grandmother or an auntie, the Japanese were only allowed 1 suitcase to take, and it was like, quickly they had to pack everything, and she used half of her suitcase to pack an American flag. Like, that's the idea that here, I am an American, I'm an American citizen, this is wrong, and I am choosing to use half of my suitcase to pack an American flag. I mean, that to me is like, it speaks volumes of the protest, and the stance that she was making by doing that. I think a lot of times what I've found interesting as I've had conversations with my Black sisters is that sometimes, I remember speaking to one woman in particular, a friend, and she just said, I was so surprised at the women of color luncheon, at the same conference, to see the Asians. Like, I expected to see my African Americans, my Black sisters, and my Latina sisters, but I did not expect to see the Asians. So we had to have a whole conversation, but often, in the Black community, the Asians aren't necessarily seen. So it kind of harkens to Get Out in the movie, when they had the one scene where they have the all the white folk and the token Asian guy, and kind of that the model minority myth. But I think that also plays into the difficulty for us in our conversations, having, voices, diverse voices speaking into injustice and how we perceive one another.
Yeah. And I think it also depends too, which country you're from and how you're viewed, like even from the lens of an African American, because in some ways it just depends that a lot of times African Americans, depends on the community, will view Asian Americans as white,
Mm.
you know, because of, and it just depends on, it could be because of place, socioeconomic status, power dynamics, and it depends on the community. But then if it's a person that's Vietnamese or, you know, or different, and because you do have racial hierarchies, you know, within the Asian American community, we also see that too.
Mm-hmm.
And so our interaction also is a reflection of that too. And so if you're not in community, you know what I'm saying, if you don't have friendships, you know, I think that's one of the things that that really contributes to this divide. But I mean, this is the thing is, you know, when we go back, you know, just to John 17, it's like, you know, especially people of faith, you know, we have to hold true to understanding what true oneness is, you know? And so if we're working toward racial healing, if we're trying to move toward this reconciliation process, we have to really be confessional and about the barriers and just some of the historical factors. So we have to kind of dig up all this complexity, and then, you know, but it has to be a both and not an either or, because I think when I retweeted what Ty BT said, you know, there was someone else that said, hey, look, this is an issue and I feel bad, but it's like, we got enough to worry about. We have so much internal issues within the African American community. I can't carry this too, you know? And so that's a real life pain. That's a real life barrier where it feels like sometimes the weight is put on your shoulders to carry everybody. And sometimes I can feel that with Be the Bridge, in the sense where I'm African American, so my perspective is that of an African American, but I have different people around me. My lived experience is that of an African American. I can't, you know, that's my, you know, so I have to make sure that I have people around me to help and be a voice and lift up that voice for other groups of people. But we can't expect Latasha Morrison to be that voice for everyone. We need other people coming to the table to also lift their voices up, because it becomes very oppressive when it's like, okay, I got to speak for this person. I got to speak, because I can't speak for, you know, but I think sometimes that's the way some people interpret. It's like, but you want to hold all these things and making sure when you see things, you are bringing voice to it. You are bringing voices into this, you know, one of the, you know, with what I'm seeing with the COVID-19, I wanted to talk to Vivian and Helen, and you have Irene Cho, you have Kathy, you have you know, Angie, you have, you know, Eugene Cho and Duquan, and so many people that are out there. You know, then I have my friend Millie who's out there. It's like, I want to make sure that I'm bringing those voices so that people hear from those voices, but making sure I'm not ignoring what's happening with other groups of people. So, you know, so I think that's important. I think this is a real important conversation, and we cannot be, it just can't be a two-sided conversation, you know. It can't be just black and white, you know. There's a lot to talk about, and it can be overwhelming, but I think we have to have grace for each other and empathy for each other in this, and then really begin to learn each other's story. I had this couple from Guatemala and El Salvador I think I gave an assignment somewhere, and I had them watch Selma and a couple other things, and they were like, I had no idea, you know, that this went on, you know, because we think about when they immigrated, like, they don't understand that a lot of the reasons why you have been able to immigrate has been because of the work that was done, you know, and especially work done by African Americans. But that work wasn't just for African Americans. It was inclusive, because although we had different things that were happening, there were different things happening in California as it relates to, you know, the Latinx community and the farmers and Cesar Chavez and all of that. And then you have Native Americans that, you know, were in solidarity, because we know at the end of the day, when policies change, it's not just for, you know, one group of people, it's for mainly all marginalized groups. And so are the groups that are non-majority groups, you know. And so I think that's just something important for us to remember and to hold and to understand the stories. And I just see that all the time, just like with even my African people who are like from Rwanda or Nigeria and stuff like that. Not knowing stories, I was just telling a group of people about how churches were segregated. Like, we couldn't worship together. Like, that's why you have Chinese church. That's why you have Korean churches. That's why you have, it's not because we wanted to self-segregate and say, hey, we don't want to worship with you. It's, you know, it was because that was law, that was policy. And the church was complicit and also created infrastructure for that. And they're looking at me with, you know, their mouths open. And so you kind of have to explain it to them, like, you know, like you do as it relates to tribalism sometimes, you know. But, you know, but that's something, even the history that people that don't understand, especially American history, and we don't teach this. And so people don't have context for it, you know.
Yeah. That's so good. And, you know, speaking of histories, I've been even learning more just this past week about the ways in which the history of Asian Americans and African Americans in this country, like our histories are more connected than we realize. Like just this past week, I was reading about how the Chinese were first brought in as coolies to replace slaves in the plantation fields after the Civil War. You know, the myth of the model minority in the civil rights era, that was created to pit Asian Americans against African Americans. But then even on a more positive note, like in the late 60s, there was Asian American activists standing with the Black Panthers, right? And so there's like this very long interconnected history where, you know, our racism has impacted each other, the racism experience, right? And so I'd love to just get your thoughts. How can we collectively as Asian Americans and African Americans better see that what impacts one of us impacts all of us, or that the racism directed toward one group will impact the other group too? Like, how can we begin having dialogues about that and better seeing that in terms of like learning to stand up for each other in solidarity?
Yeah, I think that's important history. Hold on, let me just take my phone, my watch is just buzzing. I think that's one of the things, you know, some of the history that we just recounted, that's a lot of history that people don't know. And history keeps receipt, it gives context, it gives understanding for a lot. So I think one of the things that we also we need to remember the education point. Like, we need to talk about that history more. We need to have more conversations like this. We need to have more panels like this. We need to have more articles written and more books tell stories like this, because that's, you know, there's a disconnect between that. But I think when we talk about how do we, you know, continue to show solidarity, I think one of the things is, I think the church is kind of late to the game in this, because I see this happening a lot outside of the church, you know, and different conversations as it relates to race. But I think we have to lead this within spaces of faith more in a more impactful way. I know Brenda Salter McNeil did a reconciliation meeting last year, and she brought, you know, just different people from different groups, different backgrounds together to kind of pray about reconciliation and where do we see it moving. And I think sometimes it's hard because we all have, you know, we're all coming from very diverse backgrounds as it relates to our theology, you know, as it relates to our experiences, so many things. And I think that, you know, those other divides continues to divide us, you know, when we start thinking about those things. And so I think we just got to keep pushing this conversation forward, and not when something happens. I know the Voices Project, Leroy Barbara, I know he's been having some conversations around like this. He hosted something at one of his one-day events, you know. So there's different people that are having conversations, but it would be great to have this larger collective conversation that could really create some initiatives around this. Because I think it's really important. And then there was something, you said something else. What was the other part of that question you just said?
Like, just how can we better see that what impacts one of us impacts all of us?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say, you know, there's this quote by MLK that says, you know, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And you have to realize that when we're watching certain things happen, when we see the racism against the Jewish community, it's like you're looking at this and you're like, okay, we know that we need to stand up for that, because it could be, it just as well may be you know what I'm saying? Sure. And so when we see things happening as it relates to Black Lives Matter, it could just as well be you know, how are we using our voices in those spaces? And when we see, you know, the Asian racism happening now as it relates to COVID, and this is not just COVID, like this is stuff that happens all the time, you know, but it's under the radar. But are we bringing voice to it? So I think it's important for us to understand the injustice anywhere that's happening among anyone, that's where everyone is not being able to live out their God-given dignity, like inhumane treatment, you know, things that we see at the border, like that impacts us, you know, just because the person doesn't look like you know. If we say that we're connected, you know, if one part of the body suffers, then we all suffer with it. You know what I'm saying? If we truly believe that we are a part of the body, you know, a part of the kingdom of God, I think there should be a different perspective, that when, you know, if one of our brothers, sisters are in pain and hurting, and that even goes for white brothers and sisters too, you know what I'm saying? Because some of them stand in solidarity and give up just as much, you know, in this fight with us too. And so I think that's the thing, how we really have to look at it. We can't look at it, we have to really have a kingdom view of this. And I think that's going to create the solidarity that we need, is when we have a more of a kingdom worldview versus individualistic and empire worldview.
That's so good.
That's really good.
I
think you do such a great job of that, Tasha. I've just seen you consistently support injustice across the board. And so I have just loved seeing the consistency that you bring and modeling that out. I've just appreciated that, because, you know, you're for sure, obviously, as a Black woman, going to call out injustice regarding Black Lives Matter, but I've seen you consistently do that the Latinx community, the Asian American community. I think what's so fascinating to me is that there can be, even among Asians, the racism amongst each other. And then, we've spent time in Rwanda where Africans from the same country were pitted against each other. So it's like there is our human nature, our fallen nature, where we try to other. I mean, it's a consequence of sin. And I think recognizing and being able to call out, and I think in the Asian American community to really repent of our own biases and prejudices that we all hold. So it's not, I think it starts with us. And I think recognizing what we were taught growing up from our own families of origin that were incorrect, and then doing our part to really be educating our children and those in our communities to learn the proper terminology, even, so it's, just being able to grace and truth, being about trying to help to bridge the gap that we have of understanding, and assumptions are made. I think one of the litmus tests is, are you okay if one of your kids marries outside your ethnic, I mean, that really is the point of, like, how serious are we about, it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's fine, I have my one Black friend. Is it okay if my kids marry into a Black family, and think that that's a really good litmus test. And I think all of us stand.
And if you have a problem with that, then that's something that you really need to deal with. That is a heart condition. That is wrong. That is sinful, especially when we're talking about those of us of faith. And I think, you're so right with that we really, there's several conversations that need to happen. I think people think there's one conversation that needs to happen a certain type of way. We have to understand there's different people that's going to carry different parts to this, because there is family work that we have to do individually as groups. Like, there's stuff that the Native community has to work through and understand from their Native culture. There's some things that they have to do. So people are going to have conversations, write books, have conferences, create space that is just for Native voices. But it's not to exclude. It's because of the history, the historical oppression that has happened, the trauma that has happened. There needs to be some family, some deeper family work done. The same thing within the Asian American community. When you look at the socioeconomic statuses and the anti whatever that happens within the Asian American community, there needs to be some discussion. I think about, because when you think about Asian American, you think about, that's so, first of all, it's just, all of it is like, it could be very complex, because you talk about Asia is a continent, and there are a lot of people who we classify. I mean, Russia is in Asia. I mean, technically, Russia is in Asia. But I'm just saying. True. So there's just so many, complexities when you start talking about India and just different things, Malaysia, and so there's conversations that need to happen. And momentum and organizing and lifting up, and that needs to happen within the Asian community among yourselves. The same thing as the Latinx community, and the same thing with the African American community. But it doesn't. So it's a both and conversation. It's not an either or. I think we need to have those things to help strengthen our communities, but then also there's going to be some of us that are working across these platforms to bring solidarity within that. But it doesn't mean because someone is working specifically as it relates to African American education or Native American education, it doesn't mean that there's this that's wrong, but understanding that there's going to be some things that's going to unite us, some organizations and people that have visions that are going to unite us together. And then there's going to be some things that have to take place, like your podcast, Vivian, like that's needed for your community.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? And it doesn't need to, nobody doesn't need to come to you saying, well, I don't understand why you are not talking about Native issues. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for that.
Sure.
But when we start talking about marginalized groups and non-majority groups, there has to be a lifting up of those communities. You have to deal with some family business so that we can do this oneness and solidarity work, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
so it has to be this both and thing. And I think that's going to be important for those of us understanding that, you know, there's going to be people out there that, hey, their business is about, okay, you know, we're going to lift up the Asian American community, but in the same breath, you're not tearing down other communities.
That's
because
right.
what we have sometimes we're lifting up in our community, but we're tearing down and condemning other communities. Mm-hmm. And so we're anti-Asian we become anti-Asian or anti-Black or anti-Latino. So we have to understand, and we have to understand when we go into a space, and if we're going into a space and, you know, they're talking about an issue in an area, we can't, you know, we have to be mindful of history and context too. And so if we go into a space that maybe that space is designed for Latinx voice, and they're giving voice to the issues and the problems, and we can't feel some kind of way if we've gone into that space, and that's what that space is designed for. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just something that we have to be mindful as we do this work of solidarity, is understanding that it's a both and, that there needs to be individual work done within groups, within racial groups, but then also this collective conversation that also needs to happen.
Can I dovetail off of that collective idea too? Yeah. I think our communities of color, because we do think collective, it's really, I think there's hope in that, because there's a tipping point, I think, when we begin to normalize the conversation, when we begin to have this kind of woven into our DNA. So I look at this up and coming generation and having these conversations about racism is not a big jump for them as it is for the previous generation. So some of it is just seeing the future is bright. Like to me, this up and coming generation, because they're already interconnected and have a sense of, I think, a sense of collective that's come through even social media and the world becoming smaller, even though it's still big. There's a value, I think, of being able to include all the voices. And so in that way, when there's injustice, to me, it seems like this up and coming generation is quick to say, where are our leaders and what are we going to do about it? I sense the previous generation being a lot more resistant and kind of staying within the comforts of their own, you know, comfort circle, security, instead of being able to move into the unknown and trying to forge new relationships that I think look different than just their own communities. So I think there's a hope, and I think there's the ability of this up and coming generation to help educate this older generation, and to really speak in and call things out. Like, you know what you just said is inappropriate, and it's not about being PC. It's actually about dignity of people and being able to call out racism. Straight up.
I think that's good. I want to see more people, more integration as it relates, and inclusivity as it relates to our BTB University. We need to have more, you know, Latinx students, Asian American students involved on that level, because if not, this next generation is going to be dealing with the issues that we're dealing with now, because we live in such a segregated society. Our churches are segregated, and so it just perpetuates the problem. So as we have these conversations, we have to think generationally. We have to bring this next generation along in these conversations. And so, the other thing, we have Be the Bridge Youth, and it's been really hard getting Asian American students a part of the conversations. And so we just had one of my friends, Emmeline, is working as a leader within that. She's Chinese American, but it's just a conversation that a lot of Asian American students are not having, on that level. But I think now some of this stuff that's happening is opening the eyes. A young girl who she said her niece had an issue. I think someone threw a bottle at her and said a racial explicit, and she was just sitting there, talking to me in tears, and she was like, "I thought this was over." I'm like, "Baby, no." This has been going on, but it depends on where you live, how you know what I'm saying? Where sometimes it's not seen, or we have our eyes closed to it until it impacts us. Yeah. And I think there's going to be awakening. So I would love to see a conversation also around this as it relates to Asian American youth and college and high school students. I've seen that, how they integrated that in the March for Our Lives. They were very intentional when they were talking about gun violence. Kids in Chicago and in certain areas have been going through this for decades, and they have groups and stuff. So as your voices are elevated, make sure you're illuminating these other voices that have been here, that have been marginalized. The same thing when we talk about climate change. There's some voices of students that, from the Native American community, from Uganda, that were out there before Greta, also. Yeah. But it doesn't mean that any of that's wrong, but it's making sure that we're teaching our kids to illuminate other voices. Yeah. And so I think making sure that even our African American kids understand and know what's happening in the Asian American community, especially with COVID and other things, and how do we create solidarity within this Gen Zers and millennials and all of that. So I think that's a conversation I'm always, because as we look forward, I'm also wanting to be inclusive as it relates to generational. I like to have generational conversations because we want to keep it going. We don't want it to die out with us. And so, and that's what we have to do. So we always have to bring alongside with us this next generation. So yeah, but this is good. I think this is a great conversation. But one of the things that I would say that I wanted to do as we look at furthering this conversation is having a panel discussion around this. I think it would be really good to bring some African American voices and Asian American voices together and have this conversation, and then add some other groups. But I think it's a really big thing when we think about a lot of the tension. I feel like, would you guys say that it's more so with African American and Asian versus Latinx and Asian? What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like my understanding is that Asians and Latinx kind of feel like we're always overlooked. And the conversation is such a black and white conversation. So when it comes to anything about reconciliation, it's often, we just feel like we're the forgotten ones and we're overlooked. So, typically, if there are, in the Christian community, there are representatives that are regularly platformed, but, as an Asian American woman, for example, there are no Bible studies, that are put out. There's a Priscilla Schreier, or there are African American women who are in those spaces, but there are zero Asian American, maybe one or two, maybe one Latina. You know, I don't think any South Asian has ever been, you know what I mean? So just even curriculum that's brought into church, the Bible, like doesn't have to be on justice. It's actually, you know, a study on the attributes of God, that it's not being taught by a woman of color who's not Black or white, or especially white, but there are at least some options with Black teachers.
Yeah.
Where there are no options for Asians, South Asian, and maybe one Latina. So
yeah, especially when we start talking about like larger platforms too. Yeah, I know Ruth has a Ruth Simmons has a pretty large, and she's a Bible teacher, I think, right? Is she? Yeah. But yeah, that is something, you know, that's major. So, but if we hadn't stopped and paused and just recognized that, I knew that because we've had conversations, Vivian. But sometimes we don't think about that, like, you know, but just even with that, how do we shift that? You see that now with male pastors a lot. You know, there's a lot of people you see in the forefront now, which is incredible, you know, especially even here in the Atlanta area. But yeah, that's a missing piece. And so how do we make room at the table, create a space, you know, making sure that we're thinking about those things too. And I think some of us that are especially in the bridge building space, we're going to think like that. But then some people, you know, they're not, you know, and I think we have to just go with the ones that think like that. And the same way, like there's a lot of people, Asian Americans, who's having this conversation, but then a whole bunch that are not, like, you know, that are not. So just understanding that. And I always tell our groups that it's not going to be a large group of people that creates change. It's always a remnant, you know, it's always a remnant of people. So we create something and others will come. So just like this statement that was put out, like, I'm like, okay, y'all need to tag even some of, like, I was like, okay, I would tag, because I cannot think of her name now, but she's on the show The Real. She's Vietnamese. Jeannie, her name is Jeannie. I cannot think of her last name right now. But she's on the show The Real, and she's been bringing it. The Real is a show where it has they're doing this, like The Real that comes on Fox. There's two African American ladies. Well, it's three African American ladies. One is biracial, Jenny, and then Adrian, who is Puerto Rican. And so this show has been around for about 5 years now. And they bring a lot of different issues, you know, to the table. And she brought this issue, but I'm just saying, like, I think we could, like, tagging her in it, because I just thought when I saw that, I was like, this is incredible. Yes, like when I saw the things that you were doing, Vivian, and then you're live, I'm like, this has got to happen, because we want to see this. And I think there's just momentum happening, that there is a shift coming. There is a change happening, like, but it's not going to be everybody. It's going to be a remnant. It's going to be powerful, but you're creating space, you're creating lanes, you're creating positions for people to come into, like, as scales removed from their eyes, now they're going to have a place to go, you know. They're going to have a website to go, and keeping this going beyond COVID. You know, what are the other issues that we need to talk about? You know, you know, there's not hardly any Asian American CEOs. You know, before you know, just Parasite won this past year, but before that, I mean, they're never, ever. And I mean, come on, like, you know what I'm saying? And
Oscar's so white.
Yeah,
and still so white, honestly.
Yeah, it is. Oh, it still is. But I'm just saying, like, there's this momentum happening, you know, and we have to cheer each other on and support each other in this, and be strategic about this. We can't be, you know, because a lot of this, just the way white supremacy has this power is divide and conquer. So, you know, and so we have to make sure we're showing solidarity, and those of our white brothers and sisters that are accomplices and allies in this with us, they have to show solidarity and understand these same conversations that we're having and be a part of that, so that they can also leverage their privilege in this too. So so I'm excited about this conversation. I would love to do a conversation and a panel with Be the Bridge, similar to what you guys did, to have something like this, to talk about this even more, to have some conversations around this. So I would love to connect back around with you, to have some more conversations on this, and to really keep this going, you know.
Yeah.
So
you beat me to it, Latasha. I was going to say the same thing. I was like, let's do it, you know, because like everything that you were saying about bringing this discussion together, it would help start so many conversations, right? Just the way we're connected, learning each other's histories. What's step one? You know, because some of us in just our own cultural identity developments and racial consciousness, we're at step 10, right? How do we get the people that are at step 0 or step 1 to kind of begin moving forward? And then, like you said, how do we also bridge the conversation between generations too? So I feel like something like this would be powerful for so many different reasons.